The Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana, is famous for being one of the most well-documented haunted cases in the world. While many ghost hunters can confirm that the house is indeed haunted, it turns out that only a small number of the tales passed off as fact are actually true. The Myrtles Plantation has a murky history filled with tragic events such as poisoning deaths, hangings, murder, and gunfire, all of which contribute to the haunting occurrences that are experienced there. Although the house draws a constant stream of tourists each year, many of whom are looking for ghosts, the purpose of this documentary is to dispel the myths and point out that the facts and history provided by numerous generations of Myrtles owners and tour guides are demonstrably false. It is important to learn the true history of the location because a house's past is the most crucial factor in figuring out why it might be haunted in the first place. The true history of the plantation is filled with tragedy, death, and despair, making it a truly haunting place to visit. The history of the Myrtles Plantation is a mix of truth and legend. While some owners have embellished the tales of its past, the plantation's actual history is still rich with tragedy and despair that may have led to its haunting. David Bradford, one of 5 children of Irish parents, was born in America in 1777. He became a lawyer, merchant, and county deputy attorney general and built a mansion in Washington, Pennsylvania, known for its exquisite craftsmanship. However, he had to leave his family and home behind in 1794 due to his involvement in the Whiskey Rebellion, a protest against high taxes and costs imposed on residents along the frontier. Bradford fled to Pittsburgh and eventually settled near Bayou Sara, Louisiana, close to St. Francisville. While legend has it that he was hunted by President George Washington, there is no evidence to support this claim. Bradford's move to Louisiana was likely due to his familiarity with the area. Although myths surround the Myrtles Plantation, the reality is that only one murder occurred there. However, the plantation's peculiar past combined with its tragic history, has likely given rise to its reputation as one of America's most haunted homes. In 1792, David Bradford traveled to this place to obtain a land grant from Spain. Upon his return in 1796, he bought 600 acres of land and built a modest 8-room house called Laurel Grove a year later. He lived there alone until 1799 when President John Adams pardoned him for his involvement in the Whiskey Rebellion. He received the pardon in exchange for helping to draw the border between Spain and the United States, known as Ellicott's Line. After receiving the pardon, Bradford returned to Pennsylvania to bring his wife and children back to Louisiana. He sold his house there in 1801 and traded the land and house for 230 barrels of flour that he intended to sell for a profit in New Orleans. Unfortunately, he did not receive the flour until the day before his death in 1817, despite numerous attempts to pay for the obligation. While living in Bayou Sara, Bradford occasionally took in law students, including Clark Woodruff, who eventually married his daughter Sarah Matilda. Woodruff was born in Connecticut in 1791 and came to the Mississippi River at age 19 to seek his fortune. He settled in Bayou Sara and published an advertisement for an academy in St. Francisville in 1811, but the academy was likely short-lived as Woodruff joined Colonel Hyde's cavalry brigade in 1814 to fight in the War of 1812. After the war, Woodruff returned to St. Francisville to attend law school under the guidance of Judge David Bradford. He married Sarah Matilda and lived in a house named after the crepe myrtles that surrounded it, where their romance is said to have blossomed. On November 19, 1817, Woodruff and Sarah Matilda were married, and they spent their honeymoon at the Hermitage, the residence of their friend Andrew Jackson, in Tennessee. When David Bradford passed away, Woodruff took over the management of Laurel Grove for his mother-in-law, Elizabeth. He expanded the plantation's land area and cultivated cotton and indigo on approximately 650 acres. Woodruff and Sarah Matilda had 3 children, Cornelia Gale, James, and Mary Octavia. Unfortunately, their happiness was short-lived. Sarah Matilda contracted yellow fever and died on July 21, 1823, during a widespread epidemic in Louisiana. Woodruff managed the plantation and cared for his children with the assistance of Elizabeth, but his grief was not yet over. His only son, James, died of yellow fever on July 15, 1824, and Cornelia Gale passed away 2 months later in September. Despite the tragedies, Woodruff persevered and managed to pay Elizabeth for the plantation. She remained a resident of Laurel Grove with Woodruff and Mary Octavia until she passed away in 1830. Woodruff then focused on his legal career and eventually became a judge for Covington, Louisiana's District D. He sold Laurel Grove to Ruffin Gray Sterling on January 1, 1834, and changed the spelling of his last name to Woodruff. Woodruff continued to excel in his career and was appointed to lead the Public Works Department in New Orleans. His daughter Mary Octavia went to a finishing school in New Haven, Connecticut, and returned to live with her father in 1836. 2 years later, she married Colonel Lorenzo Augustus Besancon and moved to his plantation, Oak Lawn, 5 miles north of New Orleans. In 1840, Woodruff was selected by Louisiana's Governor Isaac Johnson to be the Auditor of Public Works, a newly created position, which he held for 1 term. He retired at the age of 60 and relocated to Oak Lawn to live with his daughter and her husband. Woodruff spent the rest of his life studying chemistry and physics before passing away on November 25, 1851. He was buried in Girard Street Cemetery in New Orleans. The Girard Street Cemetery, where Clark Woodruff was buried, is a noteworthy part of the story. It fell into disrepair and was eventually abandoned. In the 1960s, the city planned to rehabilitate the area and relocate the cemetery to Canal Street. Unclaimed bodies, including Clark Woodruff's, were gathered and buried in a mass grave under the Hope Mausoleum. Today, the site of the cemetery is located beneath the New Orleans Superdome. Ruffin Gray Sterling purchased Laurel Grove from Elizabeth Bradford's son-in-law in 1834. The Sterling family was a wealthy family that owned several plantations on both sides of the Mississippi River. They took possession of Laurel Grove, including the house, land, structures, and slaves, on January 1. The Sterlings made significant renovations to Laurel Grove to match their social status. They added a wide central hallway, a game room, a formal dining room, and 4 spacious parlors. Skilled craftsmen were brought in to purchase high-quality furniture, and the house was adorned with elaborate plaster cornices made from clay, Spanish moss, and cattle hair. The front gallery of the house was extended by 107 feet with cast iron columns and railings. The second-story floor was raised by 1 foot to accommodate the higher ceilings of the addition. The house's name was changed to Myrtles to reflect the changes, and the plantation was expanded by half. After Ruffin Gray Sterling's death in 1854, his wife Mary Cobb took over the management of their extensive properties. She ran the fields nearly single-handedly for many years and was admired for her commercial acumen. However, the family suffered many tragedies, including the deaths of 5 of their 9 children, with only 4 reaching marriageable age. During the Civil War, Sarah Mulford's husband was killed on the plantation's porch. The Myrtles plantation and the Sterling family suffered significant losses during the war, with their wealth ultimately reduced to worthless Confederate currency after many of their possessions were taken and burned by Federal soldiers. Mary Cobb suffered significant financial losses due to the damage inflicted on her sugar plantations during the conflict, ultimately leading to her losing everything she owned. Despite this, she held on to the Myrtles plantation until her death in August 1880, refusing to be defeated by the horrors of the war or subsequent tragedies. Mary was buried alongside her husband in a family plot at Grace Church in St. Francisville. Before her death, Mary had appointed William Drew Winter, her son-in-law, as her agent and attorney to manage the plantation properties. In exchange, she offered William and her daughter Sarah Mulford the Myrtles plantation as payment. William was born in Bath, Maine in 1820 to Captain Samuel Winter and Sarah Bowman. He married Sarah Mulford at the Myrtles Plantation in 1852, and they had 6 children together. However, their happiness was short-lived as their daughter Kate passed away from typhoid at the age of 3. Following Ruffin Sterling's passing and the Civil War, Mary appointed William as her agent and attorney to manage the remaining lands, which included Ingleside, Crescent Park, Botany Bay, and the Myrtles Plantation. In exchange, Mary granted William permission to live at the Myrtles Plantation. However, Winter's financial situation deteriorated, and he became insolvent by December 1867. The Myrtles Plantation was sold to the New York Warehouse and Security Corporation by the U.S. Marshal on April 15, 1868. It was returned to Sarah M. Winter, the late Ruffin G. Sterling's heir, 2 years later, but tragedy struck again when William was shot dead by an unknown assailant on the side gallery of the house in January 1871. Sarah never remarried and continued to live at the Myrtles Plantation until her death in April 1878, along with her mother and brothers. The murderer was never identified, and the case's conclusion remains unknown to this day. After Mary Cobb Sterling passed away in 1880, her son Stephen Sterling purchased the Myrtles Plantation from his siblings. However, he only remained the owner until March 1886 and eventually sold the property to Oron D. Brooks, who then sold it to Harrison Milton Williams in 1889. Williams, a hard-working man who sustained the plantation with his family, suffered a tragedy when his eldest son drowned during a storm while rounding up runaway cattle. Surgeon Minor Williams took over the property, giving his sister Katie a place to live. In the 1950s, Marjorie Munson bought the mansion and the surrounding land, and the ghost stories began. The most famous of these tales is the legend of Chloe, a slave who allegedly killed Clark Woodruff's wife and 2 daughters out of jealousy. Although the story has some inaccuracies, it is still told by the house's guides and proprietors. According to the narrative, the haunting at the Myrtles Plantation is said to have originated from Sarah Matilda's marriage to Clark Woodruff in 1817. At the time, Sarah was pregnant with her 3rd child. Woodruff, known for his promiscuity, had a relationship with one of his slaves named Chloe while Sarah was carrying their child. Chloe was a domestic worker who was forced to submit to Woodruff's sexual demands to avoid being sent to the fields. However, Woodruff eventually lost interest in Chloe and started seeing another woman. In fear of being sent to the fields, Chloe began eavesdropping on the Woodruff family's conversations. One day, she was caught by the judge and punished by having one of her ears amputated. She wore a green turban to cover the scar from the punishment. The events that followed are unclear, but some believe that Chloe poisoned a birthday cake intended for Woodruff's oldest daughter to gain favor with the judge and protect herself from being sent to the fields. However, the poisoning resulted in the deaths of Woodruff's 2 children and Sarah Matilda, who consumed the cake. Chloe was dragged from her room, hanged by the other slaves, and her body was disposed of in the river. Following her death, Chloe's spirit has reportedly been seen at the Myrtles Plantation and even captured on camera. The room where the poisoning occurred, previously used as a dining room, has been locked off and is now known as the game room. The plantation still offers postcards featuring an image of a woman believed to be Chloe standing between 2 structures. Guests at the Myrtles Plantation often report encountering a ghost believed to be a former slave, who roams the area wearing a green turban and sometimes accompanied by the cries of children. However, there are many inaccuracies in the popular story about the plantation's history. Firstly, rumors about Clark Woodruff's extramarital affairs with his slaves and the amputation of a lover's ear have severely tarnished his reputation, despite no evidence to support these claims. Historical records suggest that Woodruff was loyal to his wife and devastated by her death. Never remarrying. The story about the alleged murders of Sarah Matilda and her 2 daughters is also greatly exaggerated. Sarah Matilda died of yellow fever in 1823, over a year before her children's deaths. The children did not die from a poisoned birthday cake, as the myth suggests, and Octavia, who was allegedly born after her mother's death, did exist and lived a long life. Woodruff was not murdered but passed away peacefully in 1851. The most significant issue with the mythology of the Myrtles plantation is the story of Chloe, the deadly slave. There is no evidence to support the existence of a slave by that name, and the Woodruff family's property records show no record of a slave named Chloe or Cleo. Researcher David Weishart spent many hours studying the plantation's history and found no evidence to support the popular myth surrounding the Myrtles plantation. According to local legend, Marjorie Munson, a wealthy widow who purchased the Myrtles plantation in the 1950s, began to notice strange occurrences in the home. She asked about the possibility of the mansion being haunted, which led to the creation of the Chloe myth. Lucille Lorassen, granddaughter of Harrison and Fannie Williams, claims that her aunts used to joke about a ghostly old woman who haunted the plantation and wore a green bonnet, but she was never given a name. This ghost was depicted as an older woman, not a young slave who may have had a relationship with the owner. Despite this, Marjorie Munson was told the story of the Williams family's ghost and quickly wrote a song about the Myrtles plantation ghost, a woman wearing a green beret. Over time, the narrative evolved and expanded with further ownership changes. During the 1970s, Arlen Deese and Mr. and Mrs. Robert F. Ward owned the Myrtles plantation and substantially enhanced the story to include poison murders and a severed ear. However, it remained a local legend with little attention from outside the region. This changed when James and Frances Kermeen Myers purchased the plantation, which had enough ghost stories and antiques to attract guests from across the nation. The Myrtles plantation story gained popularity in magazines and books, but the information was often distorted. The house was featured in a November 1980 issue of Life magazine, and Richard Weiner's book Houses of Horror contains the earliest written reference to the house and the poisoning deaths of Sarah Matilda and her daughters. As time passed, the Myrtles plantation continued to attract attention from other publications and television programs, and the stories of murders and hauntings only grew. It was claimed that 6 additional people had been killed in the home, including Louis Sterling, the eldest son of Ruffin Gray Sterling, who was reported to have been killed due to a gambling debt but actually died of yellow fever. Legend also stated that 3 Union troops were killed in the gentleman's parlor during a robbery, leaving behind bloodstains that would not come out. The Myrtles plantation later became an inn, and a maid reportedly encountered a spot on the floor that could not be cleaned, believed to be where one of the Union soldiers fell. However, there is no evidence to support this claim, and the remaining family members have denied it. Another supposed murder of a housekeeper during a heist in 1927 has no record of occurrence. The only proven murder at the Myrtles plantation was that of William Drew Winter, who was shot and killed on the front porch by an unknown assailant. The story that he stumbled through the house and died in his lover's arms on the 17th step of the staircase is false and not supported by historical records. The Myrtles plantation is also famous for a large mirror that is said to contain the ghosts of the deceased. Handprints and other images have been seen on the glass, but it is believed that they are actually in the wood behind the mirror and are picked up by light shining through the glass. Regardless of the type of glass used, the handprints would appear on every mirror hanging in this position. However, skeptics, including tour guides, disagree, and the strange visuals are more likely a product of imagination rather than paranormal events. It is not the purpose of this article to deny that the Myrtles plantation is haunted. With the abundance of documented accounts, the mansion is undoubtedly one of the most haunted locations in the nation. However, the reasons for its haunting may differ from what has been long believed. The infamous Chloe may not have actually existed, and even if she did, historical evidence suggests that Sarah Matilda and her children died from disease rather than murder. Contrary to popular belief, there was only one murder in the house, and William Winter did not die on the 17th step as the legend suggests. These legends, created to explain the strange occurrences at the Myrtles plantation, belong to the categories of fiction and ghost lore. While the Williams family's recurring story about a woman wearing a green hat or turban may have some credibility, she was never given a name. It is possible that strange events did occur at the Myrtles plantation during Marjorie Munson's residency, prompting her to seek explanations and encounter the ghost with the green headdress. In 1987, Francis Myers allegedly encountered the ghost wearing a green turban while asleep in one of the downstairs bedrooms at the Myrtles plantation. The apparition, a black woman in a long dress, held a metal candlestick and caused the candle to flicker slightly. Myers was terrified and covered her head with the blankets, but when she turned to face the ghost, it vanished. Others have also claimed to see the ghost, and there is even a photograph that resembles the description of the older woman from the Williams family's stories rather than Chloe. With the history of the Myrtles plantation filled with tragedy and death, it is not surprising that the location is said to be haunted. Yellow fever alone claimed many lives, and if we believe the legends, there are many restless ghosts lingering around the property. Children playing, a young woman floating, and the grand piano playing chords on its own are among the supernatural occurrences reported by visitors. The property has become famous for its haunted reputation, attracting historians, skeptics, and ghost hunters. The Myrtles plantation is now open for tours and as a haunted bed and breakfast, with rooms available in both the house and the cottages on the property. The location has also been used in movies and documentaries with supernatural themes. The television adaptation of The Long Hot Summer, featuring Don Johnson, Sybil Shepherd, Ava Gardner, and Jason Roberts, was one movie shot at the Myrtles plantation that had no supernatural elements. However, the cast and crew had an experience that they would never forget. After filming in the dining and game rooms, the crew left the rooms with the furniture rearranged. Upon their return, they found the furniture back in its original position, despite the rooms being empty. This happened repeatedly, much to the crew's dismay, and the cast was relieved to leave the plantation after filming was complete. While visitors may find the haunting stories intriguing, the staff at the Myrtles plantation often experience unsettling occurrences firsthand. One gatekeeper reported seeing a woman in a white dress entering the property and disappearing into the house without opening the door. This caused the gatekeeper to quit his job and never return. Despite the historical inaccuracies in some of the tales surrounding the plantation, there is no denying that the Myrtles plantation is a place with a vibrant history and an undeniable presence of the past. Whether or not one believes in ghosts, the stories and experiences at this magnificent plantation are unforgettable.